Well, welcome back. Um, Today we're going to discuss the decade after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction. And at the end of the lecture, I'll give a few comments on how best to prepare for the examination. Well, Reconstruction, as the name suggests, was the process by which the Union Army in Washington, D.C., wanted to bring the South back into the United States to reconstruct the Union. And this involved not only having the states renounce secession and formally reapply for admission to the United States, but also it was a very political process with a great impact on the economy and the future of the South. The big question, of course, was how to treat the defeated South. The South had been guilty of treason in the eyes of the North. The South had broken away from the United States, had started a civil war in which, as we saw, some 600,000 Americans on both sides died. So obviously there were a lot of hard feelings on both sides at the end of the war. Should it be treated as a defeated country, or should bygones be bygones and let the South rejoin on equal terms? A major question was the future of over 4 million former slaves, the vast majority of whom could not even read or write, had very minimal employment skills through no fault of their own. They weren't allowed, as we know, to read or write because of fear by the slaveholders that they would pass messages from plantation to plantation to plan uprisings. And also they were generally doing very menial tasks out in the fields. And another major question during this period was who's in charge. Is it the federal government or states? You recall that the states asserted that they had the right to leave the United States and succeed. Now the question is, what is the balance between the federal government and the states? There was massive physical destruction after the Civil War, apart from in the South particularly. The South lost a much higher percentage of its fighting age soldiers than the North, and because the South population was less. And so many have called it almost a lost generation. This is a view of a street in Charleston, South Carolina. As you can see, it's in ruins. This is another view in South Carolina. Just a few buildings remain standing. It reminds one of photographs of major cities after bombing in World War II. Atlanta, Georgia was a particular target, as we saw earlier, for General Sherman in his march through the South. And this is what was left of the Atlanta, Georgia train station. Many of the train stations, businesses, whatever in the South had been totally devastated, and so now it was necessary to rebuild the economy. So just to refresh your memory, this map shows the situation in the United States during the 4-year Civil War. Of course, Confederacy in the South, shown in gray in this map. The border states shown in green, and the Union, or the United States of America, were the blue states. And you immediately notice almost one half of the territory of the United States at the end of the Civil War consisted of territories that had not yet been incorporated into the United States. Well, some states were created during the end of the Civil War, but in general, the western part of the United States still was sparsely populated. Now, for his part, Abraham Lincoln favored what was considered at the time a very lenient approach to bringing the South back in. And one of his famous quotes we see here: "With malice toward none, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among themselves." Well, needless to say, Lincoln's high-minded and generous approach was not well appreciated by many in the North, who viewed the South as a defeated enemy, which it was, of course, but also favored a much harsher approach to Reconstruction. We saw in the last lecture that upon his assassination, a few days after the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president. Here we have a political cartoon. This was actually right before the Civil War ended, showing the task of Reconstruction. And we see Abraham Lincoln, the tall man on the right, and with Andrew Jackson sitting on the map of the globe of the United States trying to stitch it together. Now, Andrew Johnson, who became president in April of 1865, had been born in great poverty, and he only learned to read as an adult. He was a senator before he was chosen to be a vice president, but he was from a Confederate state that had remained, and he had, however, remained loyal to the Union, even though the state he was from had joined the Confederacy. He totally agreed with Lincoln on the need for leniency toward the South. His opponents claimed that was because he was a senator himself. For its part, the South wanted minimal compliance with the terms to come back into the United States, and many former Confederate officials ran in elections and won a state office. The Southern states were required to abolish slavery in their state law, to ratify the 13th Amendment, which we saw in the last class, abolish slavery, and they had to also formally renounce secession. Those were the terms to re-enter the United States. However, every state in the former Confederacy rejected giving suffrage or voting rights to the blacks, and as we'll see, they came up with a number of strategies to achieve that. However, to put this in context, at this same time, of the 21 northern states, 11, almost one half, still denied voting rights or suffrage for blacks. Now, the former slaves in the South quickly moved to establish their own communities and institutions, and the primary institution for the former slaves were churches, and they were assisted by northern missionaries, Protestant missionaries, particularly Methodists, who went to the South and helped the blacks organize small churches. And churches remained an important source of community for blacks, with the Protestant ministers who are black, and usually the most literate members of the black community, and they became oftentimes political leaders among the black community. It's no coincidence that the leader of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr., was himself a minister, and he spoke very well, great orator, and was well known to many black congregations. This is a photo, this is from the 1890s, of a small black church, and you can see the gentleman standing up is the minister. Now, Congress set up the Freemen Bureau to help the newly freed slaves with education, with voting rights, and to help them in their relations with new employers. Many of the former plantation workers ended up, well, not slaves anymore, living and working on exactly the same plantations where they had been and their parents had been as slaves. There was no effort to break up the land on the slave plantations after the war and distribute the land to the slaves. So then the slaves usually had no other skill, so they were simply working for the former slave owner. Well, the Freemen Bureau sent down lawyers to help the slaves negotiate contracts with their new employers. And this is what we see here in a cartoon. This is obviously a very racist cartoon from the time. And, it says an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. May surprise you is this article is not from the Deep South, but rather from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a newspaper in a free state. But it shows also the extent of racism that many people in the North feared that their tax money and the Freedmen's Bureau were going to assist, in their view, lazy freed slaves. Here you have a drawing of some northern women who went down to the South to help former slaves learn practical skills. And in this case, the black women are learning how to sew. Now, the vast majority of the Southern whites reacted negatively to the efforts by the federal government, the Freedmen's Bureau, and Northern troops still occupied the South. They reacted to that, and even though in law, their state laws, they had to grant equality to the blacks, what they did is they came up with a system of black codes, which varied somewhat from state to state, but their role was to keep the blacks subordinate. And there was also a violent reaction by a terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan, and this was to terrorize not only the blacks so the blacks wouldn't vote, but also it was against white Republicans who had gone south to assist the blacks. Agents of Freedmen's Bureau were often taken, beaten, whipped, and the Ku Klux Klan was a militant Protestant organization, and it very much hated Roman Catholics, and it would often scare Roman Catholics from the town or Roman Catholic priests. So the Ku Klux Klan was very, very active at this point. It died out shortly later. After the end of Reconstruction, it wasn't really necessary because, as we'll see, white racists took over the Southern governments, and there was a major scandal involving one of the leaders. And as you will see in the next course, the KKK was resurrected in 1916 and actually reached its peak in the 1920s when it was not only against blacks, but particularly against Catholics, Jews, and any immigrants from Southern Europe. And by the way, many students ask why the name Ku Klux Klan. The most common belief is it comes from the Greek word which means a small group, because it was a small secret society. Here we see a drawing from the time of a hooded Ku Klux Klan member. They often went out at night to terrorize the blacks and the white Republicans who came down. Here we have another drawing of Ku Klux Klan members. Well, once the southern states had formally re-entered the United States and President Johnson proclaimed that Reconstruction was complete and the Union restored. And apart from being from the South and sympathetic to the South, President Johnson also was a strong believer in states' rights and didn't feel that the federal government should intervene unless absolutely necessary. However, most Republicans, and Johnson was a Republican, strongly disagreed with him. And so Congress, the Republicans in Congress, are called the Radical Republicans, took over Reconstruction, and they wanted to use the federal government's power to protect the basic rights of the blacks in the South, and these would be rights to vote or rights to work, etc. As part of this, Congress passed a broad Civil Rights Act designed to ensure that the amendments also applied to the states. Well, Congress passed it, President Johnson vetoed it, and Congress passed it over his veto. So the Civil Rights Act became law. Now, this was, as I indicate here, really an unprecedented expansion of the power of the federal government, and was strongly objected to by the Southerners who largely supported states' rights. Another Civil Rights Act was passed in the mid-1960s as a result of the civil rights movement. The 14th Amendment was passed by Congress and ratified. And this is one of the most, if not the most, amendment to the Constitution. 14th Amendment guarantees equality before law, and it also extends the civil rights protection in the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights to actions by state governments. You'll recall when we discussed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, they were worded such as Congress shall take no steps to establish a religion, or Congress this, Congress that. And many states interpreted that to mean that the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. So the 14th Amendment made it clear that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights apply to the states as well as the federal government. The 14th Amendment also defined citizenship in the United States, and through this amendment, the freed blacks were made citizens. This was important because, as we saw in the 1857 Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court had ruled that no black was a citizen. And it reads, or this section of the 14th Amendment reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Now, because it only applies to people subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, American Indians in tribes which had treaties with the United States were not U.S. citizens, and only in 1924 did American Indians become citizens. Today, with only two exceptions, everyone born in the United States is a U.S. citizen. It doesn't matter if the mother is in the United States illegally or without documentation. Anyone born in the United States is automatically a U.S. citizen, receives a U.S. birth certificate, and is entitled to a U.S. passport and all the benefits of a U.S. citizen. The only two exceptions, this won't be on the exam, but this is interesting, are children of foreign diplomats. So when diplomats are in the United States working in an embassy or consulate, and they have children in the United States, those children are not U.S. citizens because the parents are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States because of diplomatic immunity. And the only other exception would be children of an invading army. So, for instance, in the War of 1812, when the British entered the United States and burned Washington, D.C., etc., if they had had any pregnant women with them who had had a child, that child would not automatically be a citizen. There is a very good video in the Learning Web under this chapter on the 14th Amendment and goes through the amendment line by line. It's not very long. Also, there are two other videos there I encourage you to watch, one on the 13th Amendment and another on the 15th Amendment, which we'll discuss shortly. The 14th Amendment, which again is considered by many to be the most important of all the amendments to the Constitution, guarantees due process of law and equal protection of the laws. Now, these are obviously very subjective phrases. What is due process of law? What is equal protection of law? What does that mean? Well, the Supreme Court has often looked at these two clauses and used it as the basis of some of its most controversial decisions. Most recently, the decisions on abortion, the right to reproductive health services, and same-gender marriage. Those were based on these clauses of the 14th Amendment. Now, the states still had the right to determine voting rights subject to the Constitution and the amendments of the Constitution. And today, the states still determine the mechanics of voting. So what the states did at this point is they couldn't just pass a law prohibiting blacks from voting, but they came up with a number of mechanisms that they thought were clever that had the effect of preventing blacks from voting. And these mechanisms, which we'll discuss in the next few minutes, lasted until the 1960s. So for almost 100 years, most blacks in the southern part of the United States were prevented from voting. Now, the Republicans in Congress wanted the freed slaves to vote, obviously for moral reasons, but they also knew that the black voters would support the Republicans, the party of Abraham Lincoln, and so by having more blacks vote, they were guaranteed to receive more votes in the South that would help them win presidential elections and larger majorities in Congress. The 15th Amendment dealt explicitly with voting rights. It prohibited federal and state governments. I underline state because that's very important. It explicitly mentions state governments from denying suffrage on the basis of, quote, race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So you couldn't, say Negroes, you couldn't say black people, colored people, they often called them colored people at the time, or you couldn't say any former slaves. Well, what the southern states did, and they did this now for almost 100 years, is they came up with what they considered clever ways to prohibit blacks from voting. For instance, they had a literacy test. They said all voters must take a basic test to show their knowledge of the U.S. Constitution and laws. And the test was very, very difficult. And if a white person didn't pass it, well, they would say, well, it doesn't matter. So the election officials were very racist, and they had the discretion to say who passed and who didn't. Obviously, the former slaves who didn't know how to read and write were not going to do well on such a test. Also, it required every voter to pay a tax, it wasn't that small, to pay for the mechanics of the voting process. When a poor white farmer went up, they were allowed to vote, but when a black went up, they were not. And still, the 15th Amendment did not allow voting by women. Now, many white women were outraged. In the South particularly, many white women were outraged that their former male slaves could vote and they couldn't. And when the 15th Amendment was being considered in Congress and being written in Congress, a number of women went to Congress and urged Congress to include gender as well as race, color, or previous conditions of servitude, and the men in Congress refused. Here we have a drawing from a northern publication of blacks of voting in an election. And of course, there were Union troops in the South during Reconstruction, and so this was under the eye of the U.S. military. So you see a black gentleman with a white beard voting. And you may notice here he's putting his ballot in one of two containers. The vote was open, it was not secret, so everybody could see if you were voting Republican, Democrat, or a small party. And in fact, the United States, as well as a number of European countries, did not have a secret method of voting until many, many years later. Here we have another drawing from a northern publication showing blacks voting, and two of the three election officials there on the other side of the table are whites. And this was well received in the North because it indicated that Reconstruction was working. This map shows the progress of Reconstruction in the former Confederacy. First thing you'll notice right away, the colors of the percent of blacks in the total population in 1860. We have seen a similar map several times previously in the course, and again you can see the large concentration of blacks running from Virginia, from tobacco, down through South Carolina, where it's largely rice, and then the cotton belt starts there in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and into Texas. And you can see the red areas that indicates 50% of the population in any county is black. The yellow means 10 to 30. The orange is 30 to 50. And you can see at a glance the area we live in was over 50% black at the beginning, and of course at the end of the Civil War, in the entire area of coastal Texas and East Texas had a significant number of blacks. It's interesting, you can also see if you look in the state of Kentucky, right to the north of Tennessee there. Kentucky, you'll recall, was one of the border states with slavery that stayed in the Union, and you can see the large number of slaves that were in Kentucky. You can't really see it that well in this map unless you zoom in on your laptop or phone, and you can see the small state of Maryland, how it had a large number of blacks. And of course, as I mentioned when we talked about the Civil War, President Lincoln did not want Maryland to switch sides and join the Confederacy. Another thing this map shows is under the name of each state, it has the date that the state was readmitted to the Union, and these are the states in the Confederacy, and then the date they established conservative rule. And so what happened is, during the course of Reconstruction, as the states complied with the requirements of ratifying the 13th Amendment, etc., Union soldiers would leave. So when, as we'll see in a minute, Reconstruction ends in early 1877, there were only two states that still had Union soldiers in them. And finally, if you look in the green states in the western part, you can see that during the course of the Civil War and immediately afterwards, a number of states joined the United States. You can see Kansas, 1861, to the north of that, Nebraska, and then, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. They either entered during the Civil War or shortly thereafter. Now, the end of Reconstruction, it started in 1865 when the Civil War ended, and Reconstruction lasted until early 1877. What happened, as you've read in the textbook, is during the presidential election of 1876, which by coincidence was the 100th anniversary or the centennial of U.S. independence, you had Samuel Tilden of the Democratic Party received a larger number of votes, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, claimed that he had received more electoral votes and should be president. Well, in 3 states, the outcome of the electoral votes was not clear, and so a commission was formed to study those 3 states, and a deal was worked out in that small commission that those 3 disputed states, the electoral votes would all go to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, thereby making him president. And that would only be on the condition that he and the Republican Party agreed to end Reconstruction in the South. And so the Democrats very much wanted Reconstruction to end in the South so they could take control and, from their viewpoint, establish very racist regimes regarding the freed slaves. So this was the famous, or I should say infamous, Compromise of 1877, in which Hayes won the presidency only on the backroom informal promise to the Democrats to end Reconstruction, which he did. Now, what's the legacy of Reconstruction? Well, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and there were also 2 important constitutional amendments, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal treatment under the laws and due process, and also a legacy of many public schools were set up throughout the South. Reconstruction served to diminish states' rights, although at the end of Reconstruction, when the racist Democrats got back into office, they continued discrimination under Jim Crow laws, which you'll study extensively in the next course, and they argued that they had the right to do this. And so until the 1950s or 1960s, really, Southern Democrats eliminated any meaningful black participation in politics through the mechanisms I described earlier, such as having a poll tax, a literary test, or another means was they would say that you could only vote if your grandfather had voted in an election. Well, obviously, people's grandparents were slaves, and they had not voted. So they came up with what they considered these clever schemes to prevent the blacks from voting. And throughout this period, the blacks had fond memories of the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, which in their eyes had ended slavery and made an effort to give them civil and legal rights. And you'll study extensively in the next course the process over the next century, and then of attempts to restore basic rights to the blacks, and of course the success in the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, we've come a long way in this course. If you think about it, we started before the colonial period. We looked at the Spanish exploration and colonization of Latin America. We looked somewhat at Mexico. We started with the English in Jamestown. We looked at the Native American cultures. We went right through the Revolution, War of 1812, War of 1848, many developments, transportation, whatnot, and most recently the Civil War and Reconstruction. So in the next slide, I just have a few points for the third and final exam. Well, as you know, the third exam is the same as the final exam. It is not comprehensive. it only covers material since the second exam. So look at your syllabus and be sure you know what material is included, or you can look at the modules and you see where the second exam is, and the material for the third exam is after that. It will be exactly the same format as the first two exams, with a combination of multiple choice questions and short answer questions. And again, like the first two exams, it is timed. So while you're free to use your books, whatever you want to, open book, open note, you need to move quickly. Unfortunately, many students spend too much time looking up answers early on and don't even get to the short answer section, which is a significant portion of the total grade. So I would suggest you move quickly, you make a note of answers you're not sure about, finish the exam, and then go back and do the answers you weren't sure about. And so when the time is up on the exam, you would have at least gone through the entire exam. And the exam is on the dates shown in the syllabus, and there are also the dates shown on the next module. The exam is in the next module. So you have 3 days to open it up and do it. Remember, when you submit the exam, the immediate grade you get is only the grade for the multiple choice portion of the exam, because I wait till the exam period is ended, and then I go through and grade the short answer. And so that will be your grade on the exam. For studying, as I mentioned before, I suggest you focus on the lecture slides, because there's so much material in the textbook. While you should read the textbook to put it all in context, you need to know whatever is on the lecture slides. And it's important, you go to the textbook and read that portion so you understand it in detail. It's also very important that you understand the discussion questions in each module. Very, very few students, unfortunately, take the time to submit a post on those discussion questions. And the assumption is, oh, they're not graded. Why should I? What a waste of time. Well, those discussion questions are actual exam questions. And that's why I said early in the course, they're a good review. And so several of them for this third exam, several of the discussion questions are word for word the short answer questions in the exam. So also the videos, as you know, as you know, I don't ask detailed questions from the videos. There's so much information, but they are designed to help you learn the material, because there's some repetition with what I say, but there's some more detail. And so most students who watch the videos find them very, very useful. Again, the major points, be sure understand the material in the lecture slides and the discussion questions. You definitely should know things like what the Monroe Doctrine is. At the beginning of the Civil War, why the South had less resources than the North, what were the major categories. You don't need to know all the numbers. And what happened over the course of the Civil War. Why did the South have more problems than the North? You should understand the Cherokee removal in the 1830s. Why did the people in Georgia want to move the Cherokees out? For slavery, be sure you understand why the demand for slaves increased from 1800 until 1860, and as you recall, the price of slaves went up too. Why did demand increase? The Supreme Court rulings. Why did the federal government become more and more active? As the War of 1812, you should understand what the Battle of New Orleans was. what it signified, who was the American general. The War of 1812, of course, you recall the battle. Washington, D.C. was burned. The White House and Congress were burned to the ground. The national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. When was that written? Why was it written? Sure, you understand the Supreme Court decision, McCulloch versus Maryland. The Mormons, we talked about them when we were discussing religious movements. Why did they have to move from New York all the way out to Utah? What were the slave codes during slavery? What were the black codes during Reconstruction? I'm sure you know what manifest destiny is. For Texas, why did the whites and Texans want independence from Mexico? Texas, of course, applied for statehood. Why did the United States Congress refuse to admit Texas? Why did the Mexican-American War start? As you know from the previous two exams, they're fairly general questions. I don't get into too much detail. What was the Dred Scott case all about? What did the Supreme Court rule in that case? And again, the Dred Scott case in the 1850s was one of the most significant Supreme Court cases in U.S. history. You should know during Reconstruction, the essentials of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, what they did, what they didn't do. What was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854? What was Bleeding Kansas all about? The famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Why was that important? Why did Abraham Lincoln say to the author Harriet Beecher Stowe when he met her after the Civil War had started, "Also, you're the little lady who's responsible for the Civil War"? What was the impact of that book? On the war itself, the Civil War, I won't ask you detailed questions on the battles, but you should know. Why did most soldiers die? What was the turning point of the war? What was the Emancipation Proclamation all about? What did the Emancipation Proclamation do, and what didn't it do? And as you're listening to this list, you're probably thinking, oh, these are all on the slides, and that's true. What was the Confederacy's foreign policy goal during the Civil War? What was the Compromise of 1850? What was the Fugitive Slave Law? You should also know, when we look back at Andrew Jackson, who became president in 1828, what major political development helped him become president? And that, of course, was giving the vote to all white men. Previously, the states had only given the vote to white men with property, but over the previous 10 or 15 years, previous to 1828, states had given the vote to all whites, even poorly educated ones. And then looking at Reconstruction, we just talked about today, what were the major challenges that faced the Union, the federal government, at the end of the war? The war's over. What are the challenges in bringing the South back into the country? Obvious one is you have over 4 million freed slaves, who very few of them have any education, any special skills. They don't have any money. As slaves, they weren't given any money. They were just given minimum food and housing and, basic clothing. How do you handle them? How do you bring the South back in? How do you deal with half of your country and you've been at war with them? Feelings are strong on both sides. So I hope that helps you. It's been a pleasure having you in this course. and best of luck on the final exam. Again, please work quickly through the exam so you don't run out of time. Thank you very much.